Hello, my name is Will Crookston, and that may be a scan of my brain on the left, but that certainly isn't a picture of me attending class at DU on a snowy day. Today, I will be addressing brain-based learning, specifically under the lens of neuroscience. My presentation today will cover many topics of brain-based learning. First, I'll be looking at the roots of brain-based learning. Then secondly, I'll identify the key components of the physical makeup of the brain that are key to understanding how it impacts learning and development. Thirdly, I'll discuss how the brain processes information into memory. Fourth, I'll present the relevance of emotions to brain research and learning. The fifth topic will identify several implications that brain research and brain learning has on education. And to wrap up, I'll discuss from the literature review several criticisms, commonalities, limitations, and the needs for future research. If we go back in time, we can look at several great minds and how they perceived the brain. Plato, on one hand, described the brain as a ball of wax that takes shape as we learn. He went as far as to say that the folds and the wrinkles that occur in the brain are merely a result of wisdom, of learning, and of age. Aristotle didn't even see the brain as a source of anything other than cooling down blood. Aristotle saw that it was the heart that was the source of memory, learning, and our thinking. Moving ahead in time, we move into the 1930s and 40s to the works of Watson and B.F. Skinner, two founders of the behaviorist school of thought. These individuals and many of their supporters saw that behavior can be explained scientifically by the physical or the physiological events that occur in the brain. One example of this, moving into the school of classical conditioning, is Pavlov's model. Pavlov showed that by looking at stimuli, we can see how responses can be learned. One example of that is the dinner bell and the salivating dog. This school of thought looks at how people perceive, think, remember, learn, solve problems, and direct their attention to one stimulus rather than another. Cognitivism stemmed from behaviorism and added cognition. This, coupled with Gestalt psychology, looked for patterns and saw that memory is a process that organizes information for storage and for use. Constructivism, thinkers such as Dewey, Piaget, Vygotsky, saw that learning was a process that new information is processed with prior knowledge and experiences, and this coupled together constructs learning. As we move into the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we look at the field of neuroscience. Once seen as the pure science of the nervous system, it has become a rapidly growing interdisciplinary field, including the works in biology, medicine, psychology, physics, chemistry, and engineering. This field has grown especially because of the popularity and the use of scans of the brain, including CAT scans, MRIs, and PET scans. This allows researchers, mostly scientists, to look at how the brain responds to stimuli, which part of the brains are working, which ones aren't. It wasn't until the 1990s that the work of brain research really intensified, even so much that many people considered it the decade of the brain. Much of the work was done at locations such as Harvard, Columbia, and Johns Hopkins. These scientists, these researchers, started to specifically look at how the brain works. As we progress in the work of the brain, it's important to understand a few of the major components of the brain. The first one is the brain stem, which is our survival center, our fight or flight, sometimes also equated to the reptilian brain. The cerebellum is really our life functionings, our respiratory system, our circulatory system, just keeping us alive. It's all automatic. The limbic system is the center of our emotions, and you can see the cortex. It's also the focal point of our reasoning, our logic, and where much of the research is targeted. Moving to a microscopic level, we need to understand that neurons are specialized cells that allow for the sending and receiving electrochemical stimulus. Part of the neuron, or the axons, are long fibers used to send signals to other neurons. Dendrites can be identified as branch-like tentacles that neurons use to send and receive signals from the axons. On a smaller scale are synapses. These are those chemical connections between dendrites and axons. This allows for that communication to occur between one neuron and another. To give you an understanding of what kind of scale we're looking at, if you were to take a millimeter cube, or really just the tip of your pencil lead, very small, it would contain somewhere between 30 to 70 million neurons. Among this would be 500 billion synapses. We're talking very much on a large scale. A term to understand that's essential to brain research is that of neuroplasticity. Willis defines this as the selective organizing of connections between neurons in our brain. This leads into a debate that's been going on since the 1800s. But recently, special imagery has allowed scientists to hypothesize that these connections, or the building of intelligence, is not fixed and is not readily predicted from birth, but forms and continues to develop throughout the lifespan. As an alternative to these connections, or the neuroplasticity, is the opposite effect, where these neurons, dendrites, are whittled away, cut away, and that's called pruning. The next major topic that I will address is memory, and there are several key components to memory. The first one is sensory memory. This is the memory and the stimuli that's received from all of our senses, including sights and sounds and smells. Most of this information, millions of impulses per second, are tossed out immediately, and only a small percentage moves into our working memory. This working memory, also known as short-term memory, is where the majority of all meaningful processing of new information exists. As it's processed, much of it is purged or removed from our memory, and some of it, through rehearsal, continues to stay in working memory and move to long-term. An interesting thing that I learned was that this capacity is pretty much limited to 5 or 9 items, and this is only retained for about 10 or 20 seconds. So as educators, when we think about cramming and how much information we give our students, we really need to limit that number and give our students processing time. As memory moves from short-term memory, it moves into long-term memory. And this is that encoded memory that moves past the sensory, moves past working memory into a long-term structure. Most research, and I found this interesting, most research supports that long-term memory may have unlimited capacity, that there's an infinite amount that any human could, through training and through skill, retain for long periods of time. Originally, I wasn't looking at including emotions, but a lot of the research that I read included how important emotions were to the learning process in the brain-based learning theory. Research shows that the brain pays more attention to information that is attached to emotions. This allows it to move past the sensory filter into working memory, and then easier into long-term memory. Teenagers, even though they have a fully functioning limbic area, their prefrontal cortex, and this is where the reflecting and thinking goes on, is not as developed. So they have heightened emotions and less of a control or filter on it. As we talk about emotions, we need to understand that emotions can trigger the release of endorphins. This gives us a sense of euphoria. And dopamine stimulates the prefrontal cortex. So we can look at the ease at which learning takes place if we can have the release of endorphins and also dopamine, which allows us to logically process this information. What does this mean for educators? Well, there's a lot of work that's come out of brain-based learning, the first of which is from Dr. Gardner out of Harvard, and he coined the phrase multiple intelligences. He looked at a complex of interrelated systems in the brain of perception and processing that identifies 8, and subsequently he's come up with the 9th intelligences. And these include linguistic, the logical mathematical, the spatial, bodily kinesthetic, music, interpersonal, naturalist, and his 9th one was existential. Another major work that came out of brain-based research was that of learning modalities. And many people consider this learning styles, whether it's the tactile, which is their touch, visual spatial, kinesthetic, the moving, and auditory or hearing. Much research shows that most of us use a combination of all four of these at any given time. Another major piece of work that came out of brain research was that of Marzano and his associates called the 9 Essential Strategies. I'll only address a few of these, but all of them are based in brain research and specifically how the brain processes and absorbs information. For example, Marzano puts it as identifying similarities and differences. In brain research, this can be tied directly to how the brain processes information and stores it. Marzano puts it as summarizing and note-taking. And this is that natural plasticity, the connections that are made in the brain, and the subsequent pruning function of information that's not used. Another topic for Marzano was reinforcing effort and providing recognition. This really ties closely to the emotional aspect of learning, including the release of endorphins and dopamine to enhance learning. Marzano addresses non-linguistic representations. As we see in brain research, the key visual modality, and this supports stimuli for the neural activity, and again, including plasticity. Another issue that came from brain research was authentic learning or problem-based learning activities. Here we can see that there's a natural interconnectedness of content, concept, and context within a problem-based environment, and this supports Gardner's multiple intelligence. It also supports the learning modalities and styles in a multitude of settings. Another major piece of work that came from brain research is the work of husband and wife team of Kane and Kane. They identify 12 learning principles. This work frequently is presented directly to educators and sometimes frequently is the most educator-friendly. There are 12 topics. The first is all learning is physiological, that there is a scientific base and premise by which we can see how learning occurs in the brain. They state that the brain and mind is a social system, and they, along with other researchers, support that the search for meaning is an innate ability that all humans possess. They look at some of the work of behaviorism, and they see that the search for meaning occurs through patterns and is processed with patterns and stored the same way. Kane and Kane support that emotions are critical for patterning and thus for learning. Their sixth trait is that the brain-mind processes parts and wholes simultaneously. Moving on, they see that learning involves both focused attention and peripheral perception. The eighth, learning always involves conscious and unconscious processes. We can see, going back to the work on memory, that the sensory plays a role here. The ninth, there are at least two approaches to memory: archiving facts and skills and making sense of experiences. You can see some of the ties to constructivism. The 10th, learning is developmental. 11, complex learning is enhanced by challenges and inhibited by threat associated with helplessness and failure. This becomes increasingly important when we look at how endorphins and dopamine are used in the learning process, and there's been subsequent studies, which I'll cite in my references, that just by teaching students that the ability to learn is possible, that there's an improvement in the students' ability to recall information and also to build intelligence. And their 12th, and they probably present this most fervently, that each brain is uniquely organized and that there's not one way of doing things. So what does all this brain research mean, and what are the implications for teachers? First, and again this is one that I found surprising, was the critical role that emotions play in how the brain processes information, especially in young people. Sousa found that this motivation, these emotions, include feedback, past experiences, and meaning, looking at a constructivist view of thought, really tying it to past experiences. Several studies found that the act of reinforcing positive emotions around learning, for example, teaching that students can learn, that intelligence can increase, has found positive results. Not surprising that learning occurs more when the learners talk, and this allows processing time compared to just listening to a teacher. Along the lines of listening is also silence is golden, allowing students processing time. Keep in mind how memory works and that 10 to 20-second time frame, allowing students to increase that, allow them processing time. And even studies have supported that time spent sleeping, 7 to 8 hours, has increased cognitive ability. Research is showing that even a larger percentage of all processed information is visual. So the idea of teachers standing in the front of the room just lecturing is not supported by research that we need to let students see. This includes posters, visual aids, examples, labs. Even posters on the board have shown to have positive results. Note-taking and writing is a much stronger reinforcement than just listening. So specific steps in getting students to take notes is important in learning. Movement, any kind of movement during the learning process has shown to increase student learning. Research has shown that attention spans are short, especially in young people. Don't plan on using more than 10 minutes or less without changing activities and breaking up the learning process. Brain studies and brain-based learning has shown that the brain is a parallel processor, and it works more efficiently and effectively if learning is presented in multiple ways, serving the modalities. And that integration of academic subjects reveals that relationships between concepts and reinforces greater brain cell connection and memory. Again, thinking about the work of constructivists, that if students are able to tie new information into prior learnings, it becomes a much stronger connection and much more readily available in long-term memory. The studies that I've read, many of them show that stress causes the brains to make connections that interfere with learning, almost a roadblock or a detour. Contrast this to the human's innate desire to learn and to make connections, that complex learning is enhanced by challenge and support. Another topic for teachers are the classroom conditions, and these should be positive. Again, looking at modalities, there should be positive noise such as music. There should be visuals such as posters or stations, and an emphasis should be placed on limiting the amount of distractions, whether this is movement out in the hallways, noise not associated with the class, changes in temperature, and even sameness. That a class that might be set up to enhance learning over time then becomes a negative impact on students, that it doesn't enhance the senses. Human search for knowledge is innate, and it continues throughout the lifespan. Studies show that meaning is more important than just information. I think about this as the old dragnet saying of just the facts, ma'am. Well, meaning without relevance does not support positive neuron connections and doesn't enhance learning. So meaning should be associated with prior learnings, a constructivist view of thought, and also interdisciplinary. How does this relate to other ideas, and how can this be used as a building block? Behaviorists would like that the search for meaning comes from patterning. And this is especially important in brain research about how the brain creates connections, how strong these connections are, and where in the brain, whether it's short-term or long-term memory. A coach would like, hey, practice makes perfect, and this allows for long-term storage of information. Studies that I read showed that the more times that specific neural networks were stimulated, that these storage units become stronger and more efficient with time. And many of the researchers showed that there is no concrete proof that certain teaching practices are best for all learners or all brains. Again, supporting that each brain is unique and each learner is an individual. The last area that I will be addressing today falls under the topic of criticisms, limitations, comparisons, and the need for future research. And this is all based on the review of literature that I did on brain-based learning and neuroscience. The topic of, are there critical brain periods? Most of the studies that I found agreed that yes, there were. However, there was much debate about when they occurred, how important they were, and even the number. We know that the largest number of neurons that we have are at birth, and because of the connections, the plasticity, and then the subsequent pruning or the limiting of neurons over time, even though it increases efficiency and speed, it reduces the total number of neurons. How important are these periods and when do they occur? Research is still going to decide. We see that the role of emotions is still developing. Even Gardner, who did much work on multiple intelligences, is still establishing just how important emotions are and how does it impact learning, especially over time. What Another area that's not clear is the exact role of each feature of the brain on a particular behavior or ability. And this is still unfolding, and an individual's uniqueness and the ability for them to create their own connections are uniquely identified to them and not to others. Another item that still is not clear in brain research is how are experiences and environmental factors, how do they interact with genetic predispositions to determine future abilities and behaviors? Basically, how predictable is intelligence based on genetics, parents, and exposure to environmental conditions. How accurate are these going to be? And many studies show that there's a lot of work still to be done in this area. Another issue that was brought out by many of the researchers was that the science of neuroscience is still strongly embraced by medical practitioners, researchers, scientists, and that this information has not been easily communicated and presented in a way that's digestible for classroom teachers, and that research is still in the early infancy. Something that I found surprising, the number of times that the brain was called a parallel processor compared to that of a computer. Many studies are now showing that, or some studies are showing that it's more apropos to consider this organization more of a jungle, and that more of vines interlacing, and that there's more of a randomness to it than the science of being a parallel processor.